History's most powerful empire vanished overnight, and the truth is wilder than you think. From revolution and world war to nuclear brinkmanship and collapse, this story changes everything. If you want the full rise and fall of the Soviet Union explained clearly and cinematically, you're in the right place. Like, share, and subscribe, because this is history they never taught you. Chapter 1. The Fall of the Romanovs and the Birth of Revolution, 1917 to 1922. In the opening months of 1917, the Russian Empire was not merely strained, it was unraveling. For centuries, the Romanov dynasty had ruled over one of the largest land empires in human history. Its authority stretched from the Baltic coast to the Pacific Ocean, binding together dozens of ethnicities, languages, and religions beneath the autocratic will of the Tsar. Yet by the 20th century, this vast imperial structure stood precariously atop industrial backwardness, rural poverty, political repression, and a growing urban working class increasingly aware of socialist ideas circulating across Europe. At the head of this empire stood Nicholas II, a monarch shaped by tradition rather than transformation. He believed deeply in autocracy as divine duty, but the modern world was not governed by divine right. It was shaped by factories, railroads, mass politics, and total war. Nicholas was ill-suited for this new age. His instincts were cautious, conservative, and resistant to reform. When faced with crisis, he often retreated into denial. The First World War exposed the empire's structural weakness with ruthless clarity. When Russia entered the conflict in 1914, patriotic enthusiasm briefly masked logistical failure. But the war demanded industrial coordination and military modernization that Russia simply did not possess at sufficient scale. Millions were mobilized. Casualties mounted catastrophically. Entire divisions went into battle without adequate rifles. Rail systems buckled under the strain of supply demands. Food shipments to cities faltered. By 1916, urban populations faced inflation so severe that wages lagged far behind the price of bread. Strikes multiplied in Petrograd. In the countryside, peasants resented grain requisitions. Soldiers at the front grew weary of endless slaughter. Faith in the monarchy eroded not through ideological conversion but through exhaustion. The final spark came in February 1917. Bread lines in Petrograd turned into demonstrations. Workers left factories and filled the streets. The protests, initially focused on food shortages, rapidly evolved into political revolt. Soldiers ordered to suppress unrest hesitated. Some joined the demonstrators. Discipline fractured. Within days, the imperial government lost control of the capital. Nicholas II abdicated on March 2, 1917. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with astonishing speed. There was no final battle, no decisive siege. The monarchy collapsed under the weight of its own brittleness. Yet the revolution that followed was not immediately Bolshevik, nor even socialist in a definitive sense. Power fell into the hands of a provisional government composed of liberal reformers and moderate socialists. It promised civil liberties, freedom of speech, political equality, and the eventual election of a constituent assembly. Russia was declared a republic. The atmosphere was one of fragile optimism. Simultaneously, however, another authority emerged. Workers and soldiers formed councils known as Soviets. The Petrograd Soviet rapidly became a powerful political actor. This created a condition historians would later call dual power. The provisional government possessed formal state authority. The Soviets commanded revolutionary legitimacy among workers and soldiers. The provisional government faced immediate dilemmas. It chose to continue fighting in the war alongside Britain and France. It delayed comprehensive land reform. It struggled to maintain order while preserving newfound freedoms. Each hesitation weakened it. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers. Peasants seized land independently. National minorities pressed for autonomy. Into this volatile environment returned Vladimir Lenin. leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Movement. Arriving in Petrograd in April 1917, Lenin rejected cooperation with the provisional government. He called instead for peace, land, and bread, and demanded that all power pass to the Soviets. His message was direct, uncompromising, and increasingly resonant. Throughout the summer of 1917, political instability intensified. A failed military offensive further demoralized the army. Economic breakdown accelerated. In August, General Kornilov attempted a march on Petrograd in what many perceived as a counter-revolutionary coup. The provisional government turned to the Bolsheviks for defense. Ironically, this strengthened the very faction that would soon overthrow it. By October, Bolshevik influence within key Soviets had grown substantially. Lenin insisted that delay would doom the revolution. On the night of October 24–25, 1917, Bolshevik forces seized strategic positions in Petrograd. Government ministries were occupied. Communication centers were taken. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, fell with minimal resistance. The October Revolution marked the beginning of Bolshevik rule, but it did not secure immediate control over the vast former empire. Civil war erupted. Monarchists, liberals, foreign powers, and nationalist movements challenged Bolshevik authority. The Red Army, organized and led by Leon Trotsky, became the instrument through which the revolution would defend itself. The Russian Civil War was brutal and transformative. Entire regions shifted allegiance multiple times. The Cheka, the new regime's secret police, conducted systematic repression. The Red Terror institutionalized political violence. The Whites, fragmented and politically incoherent, failed to unite the country behind a clear alternative. By 1920, the Red Army prevailed. The Bolsheviks retained control of the core territories of the former empire, yet victory came at immense cost. Industrial output had collapsed. Famine ravaged the countryside in 1921. Cities were depopulated as workers fled to villages for survival. Recognizing the severity of economic breakdown, Lenin introduced the new economic policy in 1921. Limited market mechanisms returned. Small-scale private trade revived. Agricultural production began recovering slowly. The revolution adapted in order to survive. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally established. It united the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Transcaucasian republics into a federal socialist state. It claimed to be voluntary, internationalist, and revolutionary. But beneath this formal structure, power increasingly centralized within the Communist Party. Opposition parties were banned. Internal dissent narrowed. As Lenin's health declined, questions of succession loomed. Among the rising figures within the party apparatus was Joseph Stalin, recently appointed General Secretary. The revolution had survived war and chaos. It had birthed a new state, but the nature of that state, its trajectory, its methods, its moral boundaries, remained unsettled. The next phase would determine whether the Soviet experiment would liberalize, radicalize, or harden into something far more formidable. Chapter 2. Lenin's Death and the Struggle for Power, 1922 to 1929. When the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics emerged formally in December 1922, it did so under the shadow of uncertainty. The revolution had survived civil war, foreign intervention, and economic collapse, but it had not yet defined the character of the state it intended to become. The Bolsheviks ruled, yet their authority rested on fragile foundations, exhausted cities, suspicious peasants, and a party apparatus still shaped by the habits of underground conspiracy. Above all, the revolution's chief architect, Vladimir Lenin, was dying. Lenin's health had begun deteriorating in 1922 after a series of strokes. His physical decline was rapid and politically consequential. Though he remained intellectually formidable, his capacity to intervene in daily governance diminished. The Soviet state, still in its infancy, required constant direction. In Lenin's absence, power began to shift, not through open contest at first, but through control of appointments, committees, and internal procedures. One such administrative position would prove decisive. In April 1922, Joseph Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the time, the role appeared technical rather than dominant. It involved overseeing party membership, organizing cadres, and supervising bureaucratic processes. Yet in a system where the party controlled the state, the ability to appoint and promote officials was not a minor function. It was leverage. Stalin understood the significance of structure. Where others debated ideology in speeches and pamphlets, he mastered personnel files and regional networks. Through appointments, he cultivated loyalty. Through committee assignments, he shaped decision-making bodies. The revolutionary state was consolidating, and its consolidation favored those who understood the machinery of power. Meanwhile, ideological tensions sharpened. The new economic policy, introduced in 1921 to stabilize the shattered economy, had succeeded in reviving agricultural production and modest urban trade. Markets returned. Small businesses reappeared. Peasants sold surplus grain for profit. For many ordinary citizens, this meant relief after years of war and requisitioning. Yet the NEP troubled committed revolutionaries. It seemed a retreat from socialism toward capitalism. Party debates intensified over the future direction of the Soviet economy. Should the state accelerate industrialization at any cost? Should it maintain a mixed system temporarily? Could socialism survive in a predominantly agrarian country isolated from world revolution? The question of socialism in one country emerged in this context. Traditional Marxist doctrine assumed that socialism would triumph first in advanced industrial societies. Russia, largely rural and economically backward, did not fit that model. Some Bolsheviks, including Leon Trotsky, argued that the Soviet state's survival depended upon spreading revolution internationally. Without revolutions in Germany or elsewhere, they believed, isolation would doom the experiment. Stalin advanced a different thesis. He argued that the Soviet Union could and must build socialism within its own borders, regardless of immediate global revolution. This idea resonated deeply with party members weary of instability and external threats. It promised strength, autonomy, and endurance. As Lenin's condition worsened, he became increasingly concerned about internal party dynamics. In what would later be known as his testament, Lenin warned against the concentration of power in Stalin's hands. He criticized Stalin's rudeness and suggested he might be removed from the position of general secretary. He also assessed other leading figures, including Trotsky, whose intellectual brilliance he acknowledged but whose arrogance he noted. Yet Lenin's testament was not widely publicized after his death in January 1924. Party leaders chose to limit its circulation. Stalin, along with allies Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, maneuvered carefully. They formed a temporary alliance to isolate Trotsky, whose popularity among segments of the Red Army and urban workers made him a potential rival. Trotsky, though charismatic and intellectually formidable, proved politically vulnerable. He underestimated the importance of internal party organization. He assumed that his role in leading the Red Army and his revolutionary credentials would suffice. Stalin, by contrast, understood that revolutions do not merely require inspiration, they require structure. In 1924, Lenin's death triggered public mourning on a vast scale. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square. The cult of Lenin began to take shape, reinforcing the party's legitimacy through reverence for its founder. Stalin positioned himself as the faithful interpreter of Lenin's legacy. The struggle for succession unfolded gradually. Rather than open confrontation, it took the form of shifting alliances and ideological disputes. Stalin first aligned with Zinoviev and Kamenev to marginalize Trotsky. Later, he turned against them, forming a new alliance with Nikolai Bukharin and others who supported continuation of the NEP. Trotsky was progressively sidelined. By 1925, he had lost key positions. By 1927, he was expelled from the Communist Party. In 1929, he was exiled from the Soviet Union altogether. The man who had commanded the Red Army during the Civil War was removed not by battlefield defeat, but by bureaucratic isolation. As Stalin consolidated control, the political culture of the party shifted. Internal debate narrowed. Opposition groups were labeled factionalists and disciplined. The 10th Party Congress had already banned organized factions in 1921, now that prohibition became an instrument for silencing dissent. Loyalty increasingly meant alignment with the General Secretary. The NEP years saw modest economic recovery, but they also revealed contradictions. Agricultural output improved, yet industrial growth lagged. The state struggled to procure sufficient grain from peasants at fixed prices. By the late 1920s, procurement crises intensified. Many within the leadership concluded that gradualism would not suffice. The Soviet Union, they believed, must industrialize rapidly or risk vulnerability. Stalin began pivoting toward a more radical course. The alliance with Bukharin weakened as debates intensified over peasant policy and industrialization. By 1928, grain requisitioning measures returned in more coercive forms. The groundwork for collectivization and centralized planning was being laid. Politically, Stalin's dominance was nearly complete by 1929. Zinoviev and Kamenev were removed from power. Bukharin was marginalized. Trotsky was in exile. The party apparatus was firmly under Stalin's influence. The revolutionary leadership that had once operated collectively was dissolving into hierarchical authority. This consolidation did not occur through a dramatic coup. It unfolded through committee votes, appointments, expulsions, and ideological framing. Stalin did not present himself as a tyrant in waiting. He framed his policies as necessary adaptations to secure socialism's survival. Many party members, fearing external enemies and internal fragmentation, supported strong central leadership. By the end of the decade, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The period of relative economic flexibility under the NEP was closing. A new era of accelerated transformation loomed. Industrialization, collectivization, and intensified political discipline would define the coming years. The revolution had entered a second phase. It was no longer struggling merely to survive. It was preparing to reshape society itself through forceful state intervention. The methods and consequences of that transformation would alter the Soviet Union irreversibly. As the 1920s ended, Joseph Stalin had secured control of the party and, through it, the state. The experiment begun in 1917 was about to undergo its most radical and violent transformation. The age of consolidation was ending. The age of coercive modernization was beginning. Chapter 3. Revolution from Above. Collectivization, Terror, and Industrial Transformation, 1929 to 1941. By the close of the 1920s, the Soviet Union stood on the threshold of a transformation unprecedented in its scale and violence. The debates of the new economic policy had ended. Incremental recovery had given way to urgency. Within the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin had consolidated power sufficiently to chart the country's future with minimal internal resistance. What followed was not a gradual evolution of socialism, but an attempt to reconstruct society in a single generation. Stalin believed the Soviet Union faced a stark reality. Surrounded by hostile capitalist powers and industrially backward compared to Western Europe and the United States, the country had to modernize rapidly or face annihilation. In 1931, he would state bluntly that Russia had fallen decades behind the advanced nations and must make up that distance within 10 years. History, he warned, punished those who lagged. The chosen instrument for this acceleration was centralized economic planning. In 1928, the first five-year plan was launched. Its targets were extraordinary. Coal, steel, oil, and electricity production were to expand at breakneck speed. Entire new industrial cities would rise from barren landscapes. Dams would harness rivers. Railways would extend into remote regions. The Soviet Union would become a heavy industrial power. Yet industrialization required resources, capital, machinery, and above all, food for a rapidly growing urban workforce. The state looked to the countryside. Peasants still farmed mostly small plots, many benefiting from the relative freedoms of the NEP. For Stalin and his allies, this decentralized agricultural structure was incompatible with rapid industrial expansion. Collectivization was presented as the solution. Beginning in 1929, the regime initiated a sweeping campaign to consolidate individual peasant farms into large collective units known as kolkhozy. Private landholdings would disappear. Livestock, tools, and grain would be pooled under collective management. In theory, collectivization would modernize agriculture, increase efficiency, and allow the state to procure grain systematically. In practice, it unleashed chaos. Peasants resisted fiercely. Many slaughtered livestock rather than surrender it to collective farms. Grain production fell. Entire villages opposed the policy. The regime responded with escalating coercion. Wealthier peasants, labeled kulaks, were denounced as class enemies. The term itself became elastic, applied not only to prosperous farmers but to anyone resisting collectivization. Hundreds of thousands were deported to remote regions. Families were separated. Property was confiscated. The countryside was subjected to a campaign that combined ideological fervor with administrative brutality. Collectivization was not merely economic reform, it was class war. The consequences were catastrophic. In Ukraine, the North Caucasus, Kazakhstan, and other grain-producing regions, requisition quotas were set unrealistically high. Local officials, under pressure to meet targets, confiscated food supplies indiscriminately. By 1932–1933, famine engulfed vast territories. Millions perished. In Ukraine, the famine, known as the Holodomor, left deep scars in national memory. The state denied its scale publicly, but internal reports acknowledged widespread starvation. While the countryside convulsed, the cities were transforming. Industrial projects proceeded with relentless intensity. Magnitogorsk rose as a symbol of socialist modernity, an industrial city carved from the steppe. The Dnieper Dam became a monument to electrification. Young workers flocked to factories, inspired by propaganda and driven by necessity. Labor discipline was strict. Production quotas were celebrated. Shock workers and Stakhanovites were hailed as heroes of socialist labor. The industrial surge was uneven and often inefficient. Equipment was scarce. Accidents were common. Living conditions in new industrial centers were harsh, yet the scale of change was undeniable. Within a decade, the Soviet Union dramatically expanded its heavy industry base. Steel output multiplied. Coal production soared. Entire sectors of machine building emerged. This transformation reshaped society. Millions moved from villages to cities. Women entered industrial employment in greater numbers. Literacy campaigns expanded. Education became a vehicle for ideological training. The state invested heavily in technical institutes to train engineers and managers for a planned economy. Cultural life also shifted. The avant-garde experimentation of the 1920s gave way to socialist realism, a doctrine mandating that art serve the state's ideological goals. Literature, cinema, and visual arts were required to depict socialist construction in heroic terms. The individual existed within the collective. Art became instrument. Political control intensified alongside economic mobilization. The Communist Party, once a revolutionary organization debating strategy, increasingly functioned as an instrument of centralized authority. Dissent within its ranks grew dangerous. Old Bolsheviks who had shared power during Lenin's era found themselves vulnerable. In 1934, Sergei Kirov, a prominent party leader, was assassinated in Leningrad. The circumstances remain debated, but the event became the catalyst for a sweeping purge. Stalin used the assassination to justify extensive repression. The Great Purge, or Great Terror, unfolded between 1936 and 1938 with devastating effect. Show trials were staged in Moscow. Former revolutionary leaders, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, confessed to implausible conspiracies after intense pressure. They were executed. The secret police, reorganized as the NKVD, arrested hundreds of thousands. Military leaders, regional officials, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were swept into the machinery of accusation. The Red Army was not spared. Senior commanders were purged, weakening the military hierarchy on the eve of global conflict. Loyalty replaced experience as the primary criterion for advancement. Fear permeated society. Arrests often occurred at night. Confessions were extracted under torture. Families of the accused suffered consequences. The Gulag system of labor camps expanded dramatically, supplying forced labor to industrial and infrastructure projects. The terror reshaped the Soviet elite. By the end of the 1930s, a new generation of officials, often younger and wholly dependent on Stalin's patronage, occupied key positions. The revolutionary pluralism of the 1910s had given way to centralized authoritarianism. The party became inseparable from the state inseparable from Stalin's authority. Internationally, the Soviet Union navigated a hostile environment. Fascism rose in Europe. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, espousing virulent anti-communism. The Soviet leadership initially sought collective security agreements with Western powers, yet mutual distrust and appeasement policies limited cooperation. In August 1939, in a move that stunned the world, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. The non-aggression agreement included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. For Stalin, the pact bought time. For many observers, it represented cynical realpolitik. Shortly thereafter, Germany invaded Poland from the west, and Soviet forces entered from the east. The map of Eastern Europe shifted once again. The Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and parts of Finland and Romania. Territorial expansion occurred even as ideological contradictions deepened. By 1941, the Soviet Union had undergone radical transformation. Its economy had industrialized at extraordinary human cost. Its countryside had been collectivized through coercion and famine. Its political system had hardened into centralized dictatorship. Its military leadership had been purged and partially rebuilt. Yet the industrial foundations laid during these years would prove decisive. Factories, steel mills, and armaments plants stood ready. The regime, having survived internal upheaval, now faced an external threat of unparalleled magnitude. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union along a vast front. The Pact of 1939 dissolved in fire. The Great Patriotic War had begun. The era of revolution from above was ending. A war for survival was beginning, one that would test whether the transformations of the 1930s had strengthened or crippled the Soviet state. Chapter 4. The Great Patriotic War. Survival, Sacrifice, and Superpower Emergence, 1941 to 1945. When German forces crossed the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941, they did so with staggering force and ideological certainty. Operation Barbarossa was not merely a military invasion. It was conceived by Adolf Hitler as a war of annihilation. Bolshevism was to be destroyed, Slavic populations subjugated, and vast territories transformed into living space for the Third Reich. The conflict would be total. For the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, the invasion shattered assumptions. Despite intelligence warnings, the speed and scale of the German assault overwhelmed forward defenses. Entire Soviet armies were encircled in the opening months. Cities fell in rapid succession. Millions of soldiers were captured. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The Red Army appeared on the brink of collapse. The early weeks exposed the cost of the Great Purge. Experienced commanders had been executed or imprisoned. Operational cohesion faltered. Stalin himself retreated briefly from public view, stunned by the magnitude of the disaster. Yet the state did not disintegrate. The war was reframed not as a defense of communism alone, but as a patriotic struggle for survival. The term Great Patriotic War invoked historical memory, particularly resistance against Napoleon in 1812. Soviet propaganda mobilized nationalism alongside socialism. Orthodox churches, previously suppressed, were cautiously reintegrated into public life to bolster morale. The language of class struggle yielded space to the language of motherland. One of the most decisive strategic responses occurred far from the battlefield. Entire industries were dismantled in western regions and transported eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Factories, machinery, and skilled workers were relocated under extraordinary pressure. Within months, industrial production resumed in Siberia and Central Asia. The centralized planning mechanisms built during the five-year plans now demonstrated their wartime utility. Armaments output surged despite territorial losses. The siege of Leningrad became a symbol of endurance. For nearly 900 days, the city endured blockade, bombardment, and starvation. Civilians perished in vast numbers, yet the city did not surrender. In Moscow, German forces approached within sight of the Kremlin in late 1941. A counteroffensive, aided by Siberian divisions redeployed from the Far East, pushed the invaders back from the capital. The turning point came at Stalingrad. From 1942 to early 1943, a brutal struggle unfolded along the Volga River. Urban combat reduced entire districts to rubble. Soviet forces absorbed staggering casualties but refused to yield. In November 1942, a carefully prepared counteroffensive encircled the German Sixth Army. After months of fighting, it capitulated. The psychological impact was immense. The aura of German invincibility shattered. Simultaneously, the industrial might relocated eastward began to outpace German production. Tanks such as the T-34, simple, durable, and efficient, rolled off assembly lines in vast numbers. Artillery and aircraft production expanded. Women and adolescents filled factory positions. The war economy functioned with relentless intensity. In 1943, the Battle of Kursk marked another decisive moment. It became the largest tank engagement in history. German forces attempted to regain initiative. Instead, they encountered deeply prepared Soviet defenses. The offensive failed. Thereafter, the Red Army assumed sustained strategic momentum. As Soviet forces advanced westward, they liberated territories devastated by occupation. The brutality of German rule became unmistakable. Entire villages had been destroyed. Civilians were executed or deported. The ideological nature of the conflict hardened Soviet resolve. Revenge, justice, and survival merged into a single imperative. The war was fought not in isolation but within a global alliance. Despite deep ideological differences, the Soviet Union received material support from the United States and Britain through Lend-Lease. Trucks, food supplies, aviation fuel, and industrial equipment bolstered Soviet logistics. Coordination among Allied leaders intensified as victory approached. In 1945, Soviet forces launched the final assault on Berlin. Urban combat once again consumed soldiers and civilians alike. The Reichstag became a symbolic objective. When the red banner was raised over its ruins, the war in Europe was effectively concluded. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The cost was immense. The Soviet Union suffered an estimated 27 million deaths, military and civilian combined. Entire regions lay in ruins. Infrastructure was shattered. Agricultural production had collapsed in war zones. The demographic imbalance would shape post-war society for decades. Yet from this devastation emerged altered geopolitical reality. The Red Army occupied much of Eastern Europe. Governments aligned with Moscow began to take shape in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and elsewhere. The Soviet Union's security perimeter expanded westward. The sacrifices of war translated into strategic depth. The wartime alliance with the Western powers quickly gave way to suspicion. Divergent visions for post-war Europe became evident at conferences such as Yalta and Potsdam. While cooperation had defeated Nazi Germany, ideological rivalry resurfaced with intensity. The contours of the emerging Cold War were already visible. Domestically, the victory reinforced Stalin's authority. The narrative of heroic leadership overshadowed earlier purges and disasters. Reconstruction began almost immediately. The fourth five-year plan focused on rebuilding heavy industry and infrastructure. Once again, the emphasis lay on steel, coal, and armaments. The Soviet Union had survived the most destructive invasion in its history. It had done so through centralized mobilization, industrial capacity, and extraordinary human endurance. The state that emerged in 1945 was not merely restored, it was transformed into a superpower. The war validated, in the eyes of its leadership, the sacrifices of the 1930s. Industrialization, achieved through coercion and terror, had provided the material foundation for resistance. The cost remained incalculable, but geopolitically, the Soviet Union now stood as one of two dominant powers shaping the post-war world. The next chapter would not be defined by internal revolution or existential invasion, but by global rivalry, an extended confrontation between two systems claiming universal legitimacy. The battlefield shifted from Stalingrad and Berlin to diplomacy, ideology, nuclear deterrence, and proxy wars across continents. The Soviet Union had endured fire. It now entered the atomic age. Chapter 5. The Cold War and the High Tide of Soviet Power, 1945 to 1964. The guns of the Great Patriotic War had barely fallen silent when a new confrontation began to take shape. The alliance forged in necessity between the Soviet Union and the Western powers dissolved under the weight of mutual suspicion. What emerged was not immediate open warfare, but a prolonged geopolitical contest defined by ideology, military parity, and global influence. The Soviet Union, victorious yet devastated, now stood as one pole in a bipolar world. At the center of this transformation remained Joseph Stalin. His authority, strengthened by wartime leadership, extended unchallenged across the state. Reconstruction commenced with urgency. Entire cities had to be rebuilt, transport networks restored, and industrial output revived. The fourth five-year plan prioritized heavy industry once again. Consumer goods remained secondary. Security and strength were paramount. Eastern Europe became the strategic buffer zone through which Soviet security was to be ensured. Governments aligned with Moscow consolidated power in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Political pluralism narrowed rapidly. Communist parties, often supported by Soviet presence, marginalized or eliminated rivals. The region formed a cordon of allied states that would later be institutionalized under military and economic structures. The Western response crystallized in containment. The United States articulated the Truman Doctrine and implemented the Marshall Plan to stabilize and integrate Western Europe economically. The division of Germany symbolized the broader fracture. In 1949, two states emerged: the Federal Republic of Germany in the West and the German Democratic Republic in the East. That same year, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly on nuclear weapons. The nuclear balance altered strategic calculations profoundly. Deterrence replaced conventional invasion as the central logic of great power rivalry. The capacity for mutual destruction imposed restraint even amid hostility. The Cold War would be defined not by direct superpower combat but by proxy conflicts, ideological competition, and arms accumulation. The death of Stalin in 1953 introduced uncertainty. For 3 decades, his authority had structured the Soviet system. Now the leadership faced succession once more. A collective arrangement briefly emerged, but it proved unstable. Within this context, Nikita Khrushchev rose gradually to prominence. Khrushchev's ascent marked a significant departure in tone and policy. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, he delivered a speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and the excesses of the purges. The process, later known as de-Stalinization, sought to recalibrate the system without dismantling it. Repression was moderated, political prisoners were released in significant numbers, and censorship loosened modestly. This recalibration, however, carried unintended consequences. In Eastern Europe, reformist movements interpreted de-Stalinization as a signal of liberalization. In Hungary in 1956, a popular uprising demanded political pluralism and withdrawal from Soviet influence. The Kremlin responded decisively. Soviet tanks entered Budapest, crushing the revolt. The message was clear: reform within limits but no abandonment of strategic control. Khrushchev pursued both confrontation and coexistence. He promoted the doctrine of peaceful coexistence, arguing that socialism and capitalism could compete without direct war. Yet crises continued to test this proposition. In 1961, the Berlin crisis culminated in the construction of the Berlin Wall, physically manifesting the division of Europe. The wall symbolized both containment and confinement. The most dangerous moment of the Cold War arrived in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba, intended to rebalance strategic disadvantage and secure an ally near American shores, provoked intense confrontation with the United States. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Ultimately, negotiation prevailed. The missiles were withdrawn in exchange for American concessions, including the quiet removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis underscored the peril inherent in nuclear rivalry and reinforced the necessity of communication mechanisms between the superpowers. Despite tensions, the period witnessed remarkable achievements in science and technology. In 1957, the launch of Sputnik marked the beginning of the space age. The satellite's orbit demonstrated Soviet mastery of rocket technology and shocked the Western world. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth, a triumph celebrated globally. These accomplishments projected an image of dynamism and modernity. Domestically, Khrushchev introduced agricultural campaigns aimed at increasing food production, most notably the Virgin Lands Initiative. Initial successes faded as environmental and logistical challenges emerged. Structural inefficiencies in centralized planning persisted. Industrial growth continued, but innovation lagged behind administrative expansion. By the early 1960s, Khrushchev's leadership style, energetic, improvisational, at times erratic, generated dissatisfaction within the party elite. His reforms disrupted established hierarchies. In 1964, he was removed from power in a relatively bloodless internal shift. The Soviet system had demonstrated a capacity for leadership change without mass violence, yet it remained fundamentally centralized. In less than 2 decades, the Soviet Union had transformed from a war-ravaged state into a global superpower with nuclear parity, ideological allies across continents, and achievements that rivaled any nation. Its model inspired movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, yet beneath the surface, systemic rigidities endured. Economic planning favored quantity over quality. Political pluralism remained absent. National tensions simmered within the multinational federation. The Cold War stabilized into a long-term condition rather than a temporary crisis. Superpower rivalry became institutionalized through alliances, NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East. Arms races expanded into space and beneath oceans. Diplomacy and brinkmanship alternated. The Soviet Union stood at the height of its influence, commanding vast territories and projecting authority globally. But power accumulated through centralization carried inherent constraints. The balance between control and adaptability would define the decades to come. Chapter 6. Stagnation and Stability. The Brezhnev Era, 1964 to 1982. When Nikita Khrushchev was removed from power in October 1964, the transition unfolded without mass arrests or public upheaval. This quiet shift signaled a new phase in Soviet political culture. The era of dramatic reversals and improvisational reform gave way to a leadership that prized predictability above experimentation. At its center stood Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev did not immediately dominate the political system in the manner of Stalin, nor did he project Khrushchev's theatrical energy. Instead, he embodied consensus within the upper ranks of the Communist Party. Authority became more collective in form, though centralized in practice. Stability, not transformation, was the guiding principle. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet Union appeared secure and confident. Industrial output remained substantial. Military strength rivaled that of the United States. Nuclear arsenals expanded, achieving approximate parity. Strategic arms limitation talks produced agreements designed to regulate the arms race, signaling a period known as détente. Diplomatic exchanges increased. The superpowers sought to manage competition without escalating to catastrophe. Internally, however, structural weaknesses deepened. The centrally planned economy had delivered rapid growth during earlier decades of industrialization, but its mechanisms proved less effective in sustaining innovation. Production targets emphasized volume over efficiency or quality. Enterprises fulfilled quotas regardless of consumer demand. Incentives rewarded compliance rather than creativity. Agriculture remained persistently problematic. Despite vast investments, the Soviet Union struggled to meet domestic food requirements. Grain imports from abroad, particularly from the United States, highlighted systemic inefficiencies. The paradox was striking: a superpower dependent on external sources for basic commodities. Yet for many citizens, the Brezhnev years offered a degree of social security unknown in earlier periods. Employment was guaranteed. Housing, though often cramped and standardized, expanded steadily. Education and health care were accessible. The state promised predictability. In exchange, it demanded political conformity. Dissent did not disappear, but it was contained. Intellectuals who criticized the regime faced surveillance, internal exile, or confinement in psychiatric institutions. Figures such as Andrei Sakharov became symbols of moral opposition, advocating human rights and political reform. The state tolerated limited cultural expression so long as it did not challenge party authority. In 1968, events in Czechoslovakia tested the boundaries of reform within the Soviet sphere. The Prague Spring, led by Alexander Dubček, sought socialism with a human face, a system combining socialist governance with expanded civil liberties. The Kremlin interpreted these reforms as a threat to bloc cohesion. Warsaw Pact forces intervened militarily, reasserting control. The doctrine that emerged, later termed the Brezhnev Doctrine, asserted the Soviet Union's right to intervene in socialist states to preserve the collective system. Globally, Soviet influence expanded. Support for allied governments and revolutionary movements extended into Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The military and ideological contest with the West persisted across multiple theaters. Yet these commitments imposed economic and political costs. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked a turning point. Intended to stabilize a friendly government, the intervention evolved into a protracted conflict. Soviet forces confronted determined resistance supported by foreign powers. Casualties mounted. The war strained resources and morale. Internationally, détente deteriorated. The United States imposed sanctions and boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980. By the late 1970s, the term stagnation increasingly described the domestic condition. Economic growth slowed markedly. Technological innovation lagged behind Western advances, particularly in computing and consumer electronics. Corruption permeated administrative structures. Informal networks, known as BLAT, facilitated access to scarce goods and services, undermining formal planning mechanisms. Demographically and socially, the Soviet Union was evolving. Urbanization had transformed society. A technically educated population emerged, more aware of global developments. Information, though controlled, circulated with greater speed. The contrast between official rhetoric and lived reality became more visible. Brezhnev's later years were characterized by declining health and an aging leadership. Decision-making slowed. Reform proposals were minimal and cautious. The system functioned, but without dynamism. Stability became inertia. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he left behind a superpower that appeared formidable externally yet internally fatigued. The armed forces were vast. Nuclear capabilities were immense. The ideological contest continued, but economic vitality had eroded and the mechanisms of governance had ossified. The succession that followed would be brief and transitional, leaders rising and falling in rapid sequence, until a younger figure would attempt to break the cycle. The era of stability had preserved the Soviet Union from sudden upheaval, yet it had also postponed structural reform. Chapter 7. Perestroika, Glasnost, and the Unraveling 1982 to 1991. When Leonid Brezhnev died in November 1982, the Soviet Union entered a brief interlude of geriatric succession. Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB, attempted limited anti-corruption measures and modest economic discipline, but his failing health curtailed serious reform. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, embodied continuity rather than renewal. By 1985, it was increasingly clear that the system required more than administrative maintenance. Into this vacuum stepped Mikhail Gorbachev, a comparatively young and energetic figure within the Politburo. His rise represented generational change. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev recognized that stagnation was not cyclical but structural. The Soviet economy lagged technologically, productivity growth had stalled, and military expenditures consumed disproportionate resources. Reform, in his view, was not optional, it was imperative for survival. Gorbachev introduced two concepts that would define his tenure: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika aimed to revitalize the economy by decentralizing certain planning mechanisms, granting enterprises more autonomy, and introducing limited market elements. Glasnost sought transparency in governance, expanded public discussion, and reduced censorship. The logic appeared coherent. A more open society would expose inefficiencies, and a partially liberalized economy would incentivize productivity. Yet the Soviet system had been constructed upon centralized authority and controlled information. Reforming one dimension destabilized others. Glasnost unleashed forces long contained. Historical taboos were revisited. The purges, once minimized, were openly discussed. Environmental disasters and economic failures were reported with unprecedented candor. The 1986 Chernobyl nuclear accident became emblematic of systemic dysfunction. The initial attempt to suppress information eroded public trust further. The very legitimacy of the party was subjected to scrutiny. Simultaneously, perestroika struggled to deliver tangible economic improvement. Enterprises granted autonomy lacked coherent market frameworks. Shortages intensified as supply chains faltered. Partial reforms disrupted established distribution networks without replacing them effectively. Inflationary pressures emerged. Public frustration mounted. Internationally, Gorbachev pursued de-escalation. Arms reduction agreements with the United States reduced nuclear arsenals. Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, ending a costly and unpopular war. The doctrine of non-intervention replaced the Brezhnev doctrine. Eastern European states were permitted to determine their own political trajectories. The consequences were swift and dramatic. In 1989, reform movements across Eastern Europe accelerated. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the collapse of the Soviet-aligned order in Central Europe. Communist governments dissolved one after another. Moscow did not intervene militarily. The geopolitical architecture constructed after 1945 disintegrated within months. Within the Soviet Union itself, nationalist movements gained momentum. The multinational federation contained deep historical identities: Baltic, Caucasian, Central Asian, and Slavic. As censorship loosened, demands for sovereignty intensified. The Baltic republics moved decisively toward independence. In the Caucasus, ethnic tensions escalated into violence. Political reforms further altered the landscape. Competitive elections for a new Congress of People's Deputies introduced limited pluralism. Televised debates exposed divisions within leadership. Figures such as Boris Yeltsin emerged as prominent critics of the old guard. Yeltsin positioned himself as a champion of Russian sovereignty within the Union framework, complicating central authority. Economic distress deepened. By 1990–1991, shortages were severe. Queues lengthened. Public confidence eroded rapidly. Gorbachev attempted to negotiate a new Union treaty that would transform the Soviet Union into a looser federation of sovereign republics. For conservatives within the party and military, this appeared as dissolution. In August 1991, hardline officials launched a coup attempt while Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea. Tanks entered Moscow. The conspirators sought to preserve centralized control. The coup, however, faltered amid public resistance and indecision. Yeltsin famously stood atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building, rallying opposition. The plot collapsed within days. The failed coup fatally weakened the Union's remaining coherence. Republic after republic declared independence. Authority shifted rapidly from Union institutions to Republican governments. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist. Its dissolution was not the result of foreign invasion or immediate military defeat. It emerged from internal contradiction: an economy unable to modernize within rigid structures, a political system attempting reform without relinquishing control, and a multinational state grappling with revived national consciousness. Reforms intended to preserve socialism instead accelerated systemic unraveling. The Cold War ended not with a climactic battle, but with administrative signatures and constitutional declarations. A superpower that had shaped half a century of global politics dissolved into 15 independent states. The Russian Federation assumed the Soviet Union's international obligations, including its seat on the United Nations Security Council. The collapse marked both an end and a beginning. For some, it signified liberation from authoritarian constraint. For others, it represented geopolitical loss and economic trauma. The legacy of the Soviet experiment would remain contested. Its achievements in industrialization and wartime survival weighed against repression, economic inefficiency, and political rigidity. In less than 7 decades, the Soviet Union had risen from revolutionary upheaval to global superpower, and then receded into history. Its arc reflected ambition on a vast scale, an attempt to redesign society, economy, and power itself. The consequences of that experiment continue to shape the modern world.